a son of a president, detained, a Senate resolution naming names, and a 24-hour window where 3 continents held their breath, waiting to see if words would turn into action. This is not about Uganda. Not really. It's about what happens when the invisible line between diplomatic pressure and direct intervention gets erased. North Korea is watching. Traore is calculating. And somewhere in Kampala, a 79-year-old man who has survived everything is asking himself a question he has never had to ask before. What if this time is different? You need to see what happened next. On the floor of the United States Senate, a resolution is read aloud that names Uganda's sitting president, Yoweri Museveni, in connection with systematic human rights violations. Within hours, unconfirmed reports begin circulating across East African news networks and social media. Museveni's son, a senior military officer, has been detained. The timing is not coincidental. The message is not subtle. And what happens next could determine whether one of Africa's longest-serving leaders survives the decade or becomes the next domino in a continent-wide reckoning with authoritarian rule. This is not a story about war. Not yet. But it is a story about pressure, international, regional, and domestic, converging on a government that has ruled for nearly 4 decades and is now facing the most coordinated challenge to its legitimacy in a generation. Uganda is not collapsing. It is being squeezed, and the fractures are starting to show. Yoweri Museveni took power in 1986 after a 5-year guerrilla war. For the first decade, he was celebrated by Western donors, African peers, and his own population as a new kind of leader, pragmatic, disciplined, a former rebel who brought stability to a country ravaged by Idi Amin and Milton Obote. He opened Uganda's economy, liberalized the press, and spoke the language of good governance. But that version of Museveni is long gone. What remains is a system built on 3 pillars: the military, the patronage networks that keep elites loyal, and the strategic manipulation of elections to maintain a democratic facade. Museveni has not lost an election in Uganda because Uganda's elections are not designed to be lost. The Electoral Commission is stacked. The judiciary is compliant. Opposition candidates are harassed, arrested, or worse. And when protests erupt, the response is not negotiation, it is force. This model worked for decades because the international community tolerated it. Uganda was a reliable partner in the war on terror. Its troops formed the backbone of the African Union mission in Somalia. Museveni positioned himself as a stabilizer in a volatile region, and Washington, London, and Brussels paid the bills. But tolerance is not the same as support. And in 2021, something shifted. Robert Kyagulanyi, known globally as Bobi Wine, is not a traditional opposition figure. He is a musician, a member of parliament, and as of the 2021 presidential election, the most direct threat Museveni has faced in his political career. Bobi Wine's campaign was not built on policy papers or coalition building. It was built on generational rage. Uganda's median age is 18. Most of the country has never known a president other than Museveni. And Bobi Wine spoke directly to them, not as a politician, but as one of them. The government's response was brutal. Campaign rallies were violently dispersed. Bobi Wine was arrested multiple times. His security detail was infiltrated. On election day, the internet was shut down. International observers were restricted. And when the results were announced, Museveni with 58%, Bobi Wine with 35%. The opposition called it a sham. So did much of the international community. But Museveni was inaugurated anyway. Since then, Bobi Wine has been under what amounts to house arrest. His movements are monitored. His supporters are detained. Public gatherings are banned under the guise of COVID-19 restrictions, even as those restrictions have been selectively enforced. The message from the government is clear. Challenge us, and you will pay. But repression has a cost, and that cost is legitimacy. When the U.S. Senate issues a resolution naming a sitting African president in connection with human rights abuses, it is not a casual gesture. It is a signal. The resolution does not carry the force of law. It does not impose sanctions, but it creates a record. It shifts the diplomatic temperature. And it gives political cover to other actors, governments, institutions, activists who want to apply pressure but need Washington to move first. The timing of the resolution coincides with reports, still unverified, that Muhoozi Kainerugaba, Museveni's son and a lieutenant general in the Ugandan military, has been detained. Muhoozi is not just the president's son. He is the heir apparent. He commands the special forces. He has been publicly floated as a future presidential candidate, despite constitutional prohibitions on dynastic succession. And he has a habit of making inflammatory statements on social media, threatening to invade Kenya, praising authoritarian leaders, and positioning himself as a hardline militarist. If the detention is real, it is unprecedented. Muhoozi is untouchable within Uganda's power structure. His arrest would require either Museveni's direct approval or a fracture within the military leadership, so severe that the president's control is no longer absolute. Both scenarios are seismic, but the lack of confirmed reporting leaves room for strategic ambiguity. Is this a genuine internal purge? A signal to the international community that Museveni is willing to sacrifice his son to relieve pressure? Or is it disinformation designed to test loyalties and gauge reactions? What is certain is that the arrest, real or rumored, has amplified narrative that Museveni's government is under unprecedented strain. And narratives in politics can be as powerful as facts. Enter Ibrahim Traoré, the 34-year-old military leader of Burkina Faso, who took power in a coup in September 2022, has become a symbol of a new Pan-Africanist wave. His rhetoric is anti-imperialist, anti-French, and fiercely sovereigntist. He speaks in the language of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader assassinated in 1987, and positions himself as the voice of a generation tired of Western interference. When comments attributed to Traoré began circulating, suggesting solidarity with Uganda against external pressure, they were amplified across social media as evidence of African unity. But solidarity is not the same as intervention. Burkina Faso is a landlocked Sahel state battling an Islamist insurgency. Its military is overstretched. Its economy is fragile. Traoré's government is consumed with internal security and the political fallout from its own coup. The idea that Burkina Faso would mobilize forces to defend Uganda from a non-existent American invasion is not credible. What is credible is that Traoré sees an opportunity to position himself as a continental leader by aligning rhetorically with any African government facing Western criticism. This is political theater, but it is theater with consequences. The framing of Uganda's crisis as a struggle against foreign interference allows Museveni to deflect from domestic grievances. It reframes opposition as treason. It turns international criticism into validation. And it taps into a deep reservoir of anti-colonial resentment that still defines much of African political discourse. The problem is that this framing does not hold up under scrutiny. The pressure on Museveni is not primarily external. It is internal. And it is growing that Uganda's opposition has learned that traditional politics, rallies, campaigns, elections, are not viable paths to power under Museveni. So they are exploring alternatives. Street protests, despite the risk of violent crackdowns, have become more frequent. In Kampala, in regional towns, and even in rural areas, citizens are demonstrating not just against election fraud, but against corruption, unemployment, and the militarization of civilian life. These are not coordinated uprisings. They are spontaneous eruptions of frustration, but they are happening with enough regularity that the government can no longer dismiss them as isolated incidents. More significant is the emergence of economic non-cooperation. Activists are calling for boycotts of state-linked businesses. They are encouraging informal sector workers to refuse bribes and resist extortion by security forces. They are using social media to organize outside the reach of traditional institutions. This is not a revolution. It is a slow, grinding campaign to make the cost of repression higher than the cost of reform. The government's response has been predictable. More arrests, more surveillance, more intimidation. But force has diminishing returns. Every crackdown generates new grievances. Every detained activist becomes a symbol. And every use of military force against civilians erodes the legitimacy that allows Museveni to claim he governs with popular consent. This is where the stakes become clear. Museveni is not facing a sudden crisis. He is facing a slow erosion of the mechanisms that have kept him in power. The international community is losing patience. Regional actors are watching for weakness. And the domestic opposition, though fragmented and repressed, is learning how to resist in ways that are harder to suppress. For 40 years, the pattern was clear. Museveni would tighten his grip. The opposition would protest. The West would issue statements. And nothing would fundamentally change. It was a script everyone knew by heart. But in the last 72 hours, that script was torn apart. Because when a Senate resolution stops being symbolic and starts naming military officers, when it calls out a president's son by name and connects him directly to systematic abuses, it crosses a threshold. This isn't diplomacy anymore. This is targeting. And the moment you target the heir, the successor, the untouchable figure at the center of a dynastic power structure, you are no longer managing a relationship. You are ending one. Museveni has spent decades reading the room, calculating risk, and knowing exactly how far he can push before the consequences arrive. But what happens when the room goes silent? What happens when the calculations stop working because the variables have changed entirely? That is what we are watching unfold in real time. And then the responses started coming. Not from predictable players, from wildcards. Ibrahim Traoré, the young coup leader in Burkina Faso who has built his entire political brand on anti-Western defiance, issued comments that ricocheted across African social media within hours. North Korea, a country with no historical stake in East African politics, suddenly appeared in intelligence chatter, monitoring the situation with an intensity that raised questions in Washington and Brussels. Why? Because this is not just about Uganda. It is about precedent. If a Senate resolution can pressure a sitting African president into detaining his own son, what does that mean for every other leader who relies on dynastic succession, military loyalty, and the assumption that sovereignty still means something? Traore sees it. Pyongyang sees it. And so does every government that has ever bet on the idea that internal repression stays internal. The rules are being rewritten in real time, and no one is certain what the new rules actually are. Legitimacy in authoritarian systems is a performance. Elections are held not because the outcome is uncertain, but because the ritual of voting creates the appearance of consent. International partnerships are maintained not because they are ideologically aligned, but because they signal normalcy. And military parades, public speeches, and state media all serve the same function: to project strength, control, and inevitability. But performance requires an audience willing to suspend disbelief. And that audience is shrinking. Uganda's youth do not believe the elections are fair. The international community no longer pretends they are. And even within the ruling party, there are quiet questions about succession, about sustainability, about whether the system can survive Museveni's eventual exit. This is the legitimacy trap. Museveni cannot afford to liberalize because genuine competition would almost certainly remove him from power. But he cannot afford to repress indefinitely because repression without legitimacy eventually collapses under its own weight. He is stuck between two unsustainable options, and the clock is ticking. There is no war. Let that be clear. Despite sensational headlines, despite rumors of foreign intervention, despite the language of confrontation circulating on social media, there is no military conflict between Uganda and any external power. The United States is not preparing an invasion. Burkina Faso is not deploying troops. The African Union is not convening an emergency summit. What exists is a different kind of conflict, a political one, a diplomatic one, a conflict over narratives, over legitimacy, over who gets to define what is happening in Uganda and why. This conflict is fought in Senate resolutions, in social media campaigns, in leaked intelligence reports, and in the streets of Kampala. It is less visible than war, but it is no less consequential. Because what is at stake is not Uganda's borders. It is Uganda's future. Will the next transition of power be managed within the system Museveni built, Or will that system collapse under the weight of its own contradictions? Will the opposition find a way to organize effectively? Or will it remain divided and repressed? Will the international community move beyond statements and resolutions to actual consequences? Or will strategic interests once again outweigh human rights concerns? These are the questions that matter, and they do not have clear answers. Uganda is not an isolated case. Across the continent, long-serving leaders are facing similar pressures. In Cameroon, Paul Biya has ruled since 1982. In Equatorial Guinea, Teodoro Obiang since 1979. In Rwanda, Paul Kagame has signaled no intention of leaving. These leaders have mastered the art of authoritarian longevity. But longevity is not the same as stability. What Uganda represents is a test case. Can a government maintain power through repression alone once international tolerance erodes? Can economic stagnation and youth unemployment be managed indefinitely through coercion? Can the language of sovereignty and anti-imperialism shield a regime from accountability for its actions? The answers to these questions will shape not just Uganda's trajectory, but the broader politics of governance, resistance, and transition across Africa. And the world is watching. Museveni is 79 years old. He has survived wars, coups, economic crises, and international pressure. He is a master of political maneuvering, of balancing threats, of buying time. But time eventually runs out for everyone, and the mechanisms he built to ensure his survival are showing stress fractures. The detention of his son, if true, could be a strategic sacrifice, a way to signal flexibility and by goodwill. Or it could be a sign that the military, the final pillar of his power, is no longer monolithic. The Senate resolution could be the beginning of a coordinated international campaign, or it could fade into the noise of competing global crises. The protests could grow into something unmanageable, or they could be crushed once again. What happens next is genuinely uncertain, and that uncertainty is itself significant. For decades, Uganda's political future seemed predetermined. Museveni would remain in power until he chose to leave, or until he died. But now, for the first time in a generation, that assumption is being questioned. Is this a strategic move, or the start of a larger shift? The answer will define not just Uganda's next chapter, but the future of authoritarian resilience in a world where the old rules no longer hold. And if Museveni falls, not through war, but through the slow, grinding pressure of lost legitimacy, it will send a message to every long-serving leader on the continent. Your grip on power is only as strong as the belief that it is inevitable. And once that belief cracks, everything else follows.